we are going to share the results of our work on really looking at the role of learning communities in professional identity formation. You can see the presenting team who was really worked on this sub-project, but really this is the work of our entire LCI research network, PIF study group. So when we look at this, professional identity formation has been considered a central aim of medical education, and it really describes that journey by which people go from a neophyte to a full physician, with the definition that many of you have seen, and this idea of thinking, acting, and feeling like a physician. And so it's also in the context of the community of practice, model developed by Lavin Wagner, and Cruz and Cruz really are the folks who have adapted this to medicine or talked about it, and really focuses on the importance of socialization within a community, and objectives are focused on support and acculturation of maturing individuals. And there's talk about participation in ceremonies and rituals, reflective exercises, and structured social events. And support from peers, students, faculty, and staff, or the lack of it, have significant impact. But there really are limited multi-institutional PIF studies. So that got our research network interested in that, because learning communities really are intentionally designed communities of practice. You know, students and faculty who are actively engaged in learning with and from each other, and they're really relatively recent in medical education. With the numbers you can see here in the increase from 18 schools in 2006 to 66 in 2013. There's a range of curricular emphasis, professionalism, clinical skills, promotion of student and faculty relationships and student wellness. And there's limited study, even though learning communities have talked about supporting PIF, there's limited study of this thus far. So the aim of our study was to expand our understanding of the contribution of learning communities to student professional identity formation. And what we did was we were going to describe this from graduating medical students at 4 U.S. medical schools with established learning communities. So in 2017, our research network formed, and there were really 4 sub-questions that were addressed in this whole study looking at professional identity formation. One was the journey and students' identity transformation. The next is mechanisms students use to develop professional identity, the learning community factors and their importance in PIF, and then non-learning community factors. And this presentation is going to focus on that, the learning community factors and their importance in professional identity formation. And there's other presentations during this conference that will talk about some of these other questions. We had a multi-site study. You can see the schools that were involved in this study. We involved 53 final year students selected to get a comprehensive but retrospective view of the professional identity formation process, and developed an instrument that was a semi-structured interview. We told you about the 4 questions that were really asked. And we deliberately used schools with different models of learning communities, 2 whose focus was on professional development, and that was Hopkins and UMass, and 2 whose focus was on creating purposeful community, which was Iowa and Rosalind Franklin. We didn't use any school whose purpose was creating a sense of integration and wholeness, the least representative focus of learning communities. Our evaluation methods: first, we got IRB approval. We recorded and transcribed the interviews using the TEMI app. They were loaded into Deduce, which is a software program, which helps us store code and analyze qualitative data. And then our initial code book was developed by two research team members, Louise Arnold and Marge Wenrick, who have extensive background in qualitative analysis experience. And then our whole team looked at an exemplar transcript, discussed coding, got comfortable with the codes during an in-person meeting, and then several Zoom monthly phone calls. And then for the 53 transcripts, we set up 6 coding teams with regular review of, on average, 9 separate transcripts each. And then spent full team phone calls for the discussion of the code book and review of challenging passages monthly. So when we looked at the learning communities, what we saw were these are the learning community codes. So we talked about learning community factors that were important in PIF. So relationships, structural characteristics of the learning communities, curricular features, and institutional context, and then the miscellaneous other features, as well as a set of codes that talked about the relative importance of learning communities overall, what factors made the learning communities important, and what was the effect of that important factor. And what we found was that learning communities promote professional identity formation through creating structures to build personal and professional relationships, planning varied curriculum, and promoting reflection for learning, really focused on building relationships over time that create a safe space that allowed students to be vulnerable, and then promoted student development through leadership opportunities. So what I'll share with you with some representative quotes, and these are much thicker quotes than in the last presentation, but I'll really highlight some of the features and you'll be able to read them as well. But the way they created structures of support, some of it was physical and some of it was social. And so the first quote from an Iowa student really talked about the building that they constructed. And she said, I had made a bunch of upperclassmen friends because we're always hanging out in those learning communities. And whenever I needed to study, I would go there to avoid distraction. And the upper class students always had really great tricks and tips about like where to find a good study guide, how to study for different tests. And so this idea of going to a shared space was important. And one of the UMass students talked about a different kind of structure in the structure of the mentor groups. When you're learning how to interview patients, you're with the same group of learning community students. When you're learning how to do physical diagnosis, you're with the same group. When you're practicing interviewing patients in the hospital as a late second year, you're with the same people. And then you're going through residency application process. So the career and academic support that they got and the academic and career support for and from senior students was seen as a significant support structure. All of this we came to see created a sense of belonging and this idea of having a room of one's own or space that they would share. One of the Hopkins students talked, it was nice to have a group like a molecule. Go to a place that you could call yours. I think that's the physical effect on the psychology of being a medical student. And then within that group, you're a part of this larger group that was in the college. And in that college had a physical room. Like we had a fridge and a sink and a living room study area and our own locker. We owned real estate, you know what I mean? And that idea of combination of people and space created this sense of belonging. What we did find in a minority of cases, though, is that some of this structure, it seemed to precede professional identity formation, but it didn't predict it necessarily. And so one of our students at UMass said, I was a tour guide for learning communities. They divide up the class into smaller cohorts. There's vertical integration, so you can reach out to people who are above and below you in training. I can't help but feel that this was more theoretical. There's a lot of great talking points that I can easily rattle off. I know recently we had specialty mentors for each house. There was integration of the librarians. There was also the doctoring of clinical skills curriculum and a lot of talk about should your anatomy group be the same. I just felt like there was a lot of time and effort to try to create groups of people that don't necessarily need to be in a group together. It didn't really influence me in any particular way. This particular student talked about being particularly extroverted and felt like he would make social contacts regardless. And so didn't feel like this was necessarily of value. Our second theme, we found that learning communities provide venues to process a range of experiences in conflict. This was a student from Rosalind Franklin, and particularly noted that they said, I wasn't very social with a lot of the students because I have a different lifestyle that, like I said, everyone moved to the city. I didn't. I have a husband and I have a kid. I have a lot going on. So sometimes it would be hard for me to connect with the other students. So I didn't know what was going on with everybody. So for me, it was nice to hear like other people like commiserate and gripe about like, oh, this is really bad, or this resident. Hearing these things, or else all I would have would be my perspective at medical school. So by going to the communities and listening to everyone, it was good to get those perspectives. So here's a student who feels like they would have been isolated, save for the learning communities. Learning communities also promote reflection on their people's experience, and really felt like this was an important habit to get into. And another student from Rosalind Franklin said, so I feel like the way that rather than like one big thing, it actually helped me a lot through a lot of smaller things. The biggest takeaway from it was that it instills within us this sort of like self-reflective process that allows us to think critically about the emotional aspects of things that we are going through. It kind of like humanizes things for us. Reminded us that we are human beings as well, and that we are allowed to experience, human emotions, have a human experience through this whole process. Learning communities also create continuity relationships, which became important, and a safe space that allowed students to be vulnerable. So one student, also at Rosalind Franklin, talked about some of the reflections in third year, and commented that it was just a safe space to share things, knowing that you were surrounded by people who understood what you were and what you were going through. A UMass student talked about career decision-making and being really having a difficult time with it, and related in a conversation with her group. I felt supported by my senior mentor and my colleagues. And a lot of them said they really respected how vulnerable I made myself. And finally, from early on, one of the Hopkins students talked about the fact that we had a sort of duty to admit what early on I see was a kind of difficult, embarrassing thing. It's kind of being vulnerable in front of others. And that habit allowed these longitudinal groups to help each other over time. And finally, the opportunity for leadership was featured by a number of different students. And this first quote is kind of interesting because it's somebody who's talking about doing well academically. And she said, I was getting honors and everything, and that was great, but I wasn't seeing my family. I wasn't getting to go to the gym. I wasn't going to church, and I wasn't doing all the things that make me me. And so throughout medical school, I figured out how to do the best I can without losing myself. And that was, I guess, where I grew. And the learning communities really helped me to do that, because that's what I'm good at, is leadership, keeping people together, facilitating bonding and relationship. And I do that in the learning communities in the medical setting. And then somebody talked about being in the government structure and serving in a leadership position. So what we came up with really was a model that with all of these elements that supports belonging, and over time, with these students who belong within the community, is the idea of becoming, and taking what are sometimes unconscious experiences and through conversation, making them more conscious processes of one of formation. And so we realized that what emerged as we really immersed ourselves in this data was a bigger picture, and that it seemed like the students were talking about establishing a relational culture. And so we thought that setting the expectation of mentoring can change the culture, and that continuity of relationship over time allows for growth and change and the opportunity to make unconscious processes conscious. two students talked about the mentoring culture. One was that being mentored and having that college community, as a senior student, all of a sudden the person interviewed found themselves in a different position. It was the first place where I kind of started being able to do a little bit of advising, and realized how I can help with them as they're moving forward, moving through their experience. So mentoring seems to beget mentoring, which is something that the broader mentoring literature suggests. And then this relates a little bit to the last presentation. Here's a student who says, my learning community mentor, she was very helpful and checking in, and I would check in with her. It also fostered engagement and communication with her. I also identified with one mentor who was just kind of reaching out and through email. It was just asking, trying to set up an informational interview that ended up extending towards a more structured mentoring experience. And this person also happens to be a person of color. And through that interaction with her, I was attracted to another physician of color who I'm also kind of in contact with. So another way that our students are connecting, not only with their mentors, but with other mentors within the institution. This continuity over time seemed to foster student growth and maturing, and made some of the processes of medicine and some of the way things worked in medicine that seemed unconscious, more conscious. So one of the Hopkins students said, originally, I must admit, I did not like it, the learning communities. I did not like it because of the fact that the people that were in my college and my group were not the people that I naturally would have gotten along with. It does force you to challenge your thinking because you're working with people very closely. I think I see my relationships with colleges as a side effect of some of this growth. I saw how some of these relationships between providers in the real world work. So thinking back on all that, I would say that the people that are more supportive about my future were a lot of my peers. The limitations in our study is the current report is based only on the LC portion of the interview transcripts and its final year student views. And we really need to understand earlier points of view, not just retrospective views at the end of medical school, especially because some of our data suggests that the learning communities have most impact in the preclinical years, which needs to be studied. And I'll finish, instead of offering a traditional conclusions of talking about structures and talking about relationship and talking about reflection and being vulnerable and talking about leadership, to just share what I feel like our interviewees shared with us, which were their stories. And this comes from a piece in the New England Journal called Into the Water, talking about the clinical years. And the particular student said the third year of medical school is like being thrown headfirst into the water. And although the impact is jarring, eventually the experience becomes natural. Now, when I read this, I was really moved by it, and we use it in our curriculum. But if you track back, you look at it, some of it talks about its origins in a commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace at Kenyon College. And he starts it talking about two fish swimming along in the water. And an older fish is swimming by the other way. And he says, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish look at each other and say, "What the hell is water?" And so at the end of his speech, what David Foster Wallace says is the point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. And I would suggest that our data is saying that that's what learning communities are doing, is making some of this unconscious parts of medical school conscious, and we're increasingly comfortable talking about them. So what David Foster Wallace concludes is that we should simply look at this picture and say, this is water. Thank you for your attention.